We're here today with Matthew Barge of the NYU Policing Project, and I'd like to really thank you for participating with us on this. We think this was important even before COVID-19, but with the number of killings that have happened and really a rise in the schism between police and community, we think this conversation is particularly useful. So talking from that, what effective steps can we start to take in terms of trying to heal these rifts between communities and the police?
Well, thank you for having me and focusing on these issues. I think that there are a number of things that we need to do in our country to address issues related to inequity and justice and systemic racism. But I think the unique intersection that law enforcement have with communities and communities of all stripes and races and creeds and identities and experiences and backgrounds. When you look at policing, policing has actually only been professionalized in sort of the contemporary sense for maybe 50 years or so. And so now I think that the point I was making is that when you look at policing in America, we've not always done policing the same way. When you look at how law enforcement has happened, we don't do it the same way now that we did 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And thank God we don't. Policing has become more professionalized, and it's become a bit more rigorous. I mean, if you go back even 40 or 50 years, the notion that a police department would have a policy handbook was something that was slightly novel and less rigorous and less significant than it is now. We have a tremendous amount more that needs to be done, but I raise all of that because I think that the notion that we are consigned to be as we have always been, that policing has to continue on as it has existed in this country as of late and more recently, is a misnomer. That's a false choice. We can look at policing and determine what do communities need, what do our communities need for their health, for their well-being, and for their safety, and how do we do it in a way that meets the needs of our communities in an ongoing and responsive type of way. Fundamentally, in a democracy, we get to decide how we are governed, how laws are enforced, what the laws are. We get to decide collectively. And for too long, really, it has been the police, police departments, police organizations, policing as an enterprise that have determined what public safety is, how it should look like, and how it should be done. And so at the Policing Project, as well as in another hat that I play with 21CP Solutions, which is an outgrowth of President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. We are committed to the notion that what needs to happen with respect to policing is for police not to be the ones who drive the conception of public safety, but that the community defines it for the police, defines how public safety should be effectuated in our communities. And, essentially the police serve the community's vision and voice and expectations with respect to what that looks like. That is, to me, a very common sense notion, but it's different than what typically has gone on in the United States. Protocols for how police perform, as far as policies and expectations, are set by the police departments themselves. Systems for how police performance may be scrutinized and how police may be held accountable when they have performed contrary to expectations. Those systems are usually established by the police departments themselves. And so we have a long way to go to get to a system where it is us, it is the democratic we the people who articulate for law enforcement how we expect for them as public servants, as our public servants, to provide for our public safety. And so I think most fundamentally, what we need for police reform to be effective is a reimagination of what public safety is and how police fit into that definition.
Now, obviously, as you know better than most, Governor Cuomo has set April of next year as a date when localities of all different sizes should come in with reform packages for what they can do with their policing. What successful reform have you seen? You obviously are not limited to New York State or city. You know things that are going on across the country. Have you seen successful reform efforts?
Yeah, I have. It depends to some extent on how you are defining reform. You know, everything that I just said about the need to reimagine systemically what public safety is and how police play into that sort of is not inconsistent with the notion, which I also believe, that we need to take concrete steps today so that police perform better tomorrow, so that the dire consequences, the instances of gross injustice, of needless officer involved use of force situations and the like, so that those are addressed, right? So that there are better outcomes for everyone tomorrow, even as we might be thinking in the longer term about how we can change systems so that these situations never happen in the first place. I think first and foremost, with respect to specific reforms, agency policies need to be better. They need to be more rigorous. Use of force policies usually do a very poor job at articulating what officers need to know with respect to what an agency expects of them in the use of force decision making process. It's typical that most agency policies just sort of broadly cite Supreme Court precedent, which is incredibly unhelpful. The courts have completely dropped the ball at giving officers the tools and the specific guidance they need to understand when force is and is not allowed. And it's really up to individual agencies to define clearer, more specific rules of the road for how officers use force. This means that there should be an articulation that force is used when it's only when it's necessary, when it's proportional to the threat that a subject may be posing to officers or to others, that the force be reasonable, which is the legal requirement, and that force is used only when de-escalation has been tried and failed or it's not feasible, given the nature of a threat that a subject may be posing. So necessity, proportionality, reasonableness, de-escalation, those are benchmarks that officers can learn about, they can grasp onto, and most importantly, they can remember in fast evolving situations when they're armed with appropriate training and they can apply in the real world. So making things like use of force policies specific, policies on stops and searches and arrests. Some departments that I have looked at simply don't have any written guidance on when officers may stop and detain an individual, what happens during those encounters, and procedures for arresting individuals if it's warranted. The policy books are simply silent. Of course, officers get training, formal and informal, I guess, on those sorts of topics. But in order to hold officers accountable for meeting your expectations, you have to set out what those expectations are. And so, in that area and in a host of areas, you need good policies. There are some who point to the fact that training in and of itself to officers is not something that maybe moves the needle, and I think that's right. Depending on the quality of training and the applicability of that training to what officers actually encounter day in and day out, that can be true. A lot of police officer training is very bad. It involves death by PowerPoint, sort of very passive, march through slides of content, which is really not the kind of training that officers need. Former Supreme Court justice is said to have observed that a police officer on a daily basis is provided more discretion than any judges in our American system, justice system. And I think that's probably true. Officers, their jobs are to respond to instances where there are issues, where there are problems, where there are people who can't solve problems for themselves and figure out what to do. And they're constantly encountering novel situations. That points toward not training that's passive, that's PowerPoint, that's a dump of sort of book learning information, but rather points to training that is scenario based, that's pragmatic, that is really decision making training that provides officers with realistic scenarios and asks them to to respond, to go through them, to practice applying an agency's policies, to encounter some difficult situations. And that type of training, I think, is something that too few police departments do and can be tremendously impactful, right? Pilots, for example, don't simply go to aeronautical school and look at PowerPoint slides about how an airplane works. They get in a flight simulator and they spend significant time in it, and they encounter stressful situations, emergency situations, and kind of try to figure out in a controlled environment how they would respond, what they can do, figure out where there are opportunities for learning. And that's the kind of training we need to give to police officers as well. The final thing I would say is that obviously you've got to hold officers accountable for the expectations that you're providing and the training that you're giving to them in order so that they understand those expectations. And so everything that we might refer to as accountability, holding officers accountable, those internal and external systems to ensure that officers and departments overall are doing what is expected of them, are doing what the community and police department policy are setting forth for departments to do. That system of accountability is also incredibly important to establish really clear rules of the road for how that works.
Can you point to a locality or city that's done some of this, that seems to be moving forward along this line?
Sure. I mean, using the example with respect to use of force policies, there are places that implemented the type of policies that I was outlining, where concepts of necessity and proportionality and de-escalation are expressly called for. Places that have sketched out very clear sets of instances where officers cannot use force, like using force against an already handcuffed or restrained individual. There are places that have implemented those use of force policies, places like Seattle, like Cleveland, like New Orleans. Use of force in those jurisdictions has decreased. And that even as use of force was decreasing in those places, officer injuries did not go up, so it didn't make officers any less safe. It didn't make crime go up. It didn't make the public any less safe. And it made subjects more safe with respect to not incurring as much in the way of injury. So there are places that have implemented more specific policies and better training on something as critical and core as use of force, where you can see that force is used less by the police department. It's relied on less by officers to resolve situations. And not only did nobody get less safe, people got safer, officers and the public alike. I think that is a real world significant impact that can be had by something as elementary seeming as changing policy or providing more training. That doesn't mean that those places haven't experienced issues, or that those places are solved of all situations that have troubled communities, and that communities are continuing to talk about. But what it does mean, I think, pretty critically, is that a lot fewer people had force applied to them. That officers entered into situations that were a potential threat to them a lot less frequently, and that I think is a significant moving of the needle. But we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country of all sizes, of all charges, and a very, very small percentage of departments have policies and have provided training to officers of the sort that I've just outlined. But I think that the same results are possible in all of those jurisdictions through reforms of the sort I described.
Is there, in your view, any assessment device that either the public or police departments could have that would sort of raise alarm bells when things seem to be going awry? In other words, could the public at least have some indication that we have to intervene here because you're seeing signs of this relationship and use of force escalating or getting worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think It's a great question. I'm not sure that there's one particular thing or one particular metric or one particular set of data that indicates, definitively that an agency has a problem or not. I mean, actually, at the policing project at NYU, we're working with the support of places like Microsoft on essentially an assessment instrument, kind of, we're calling it, at least right now in preliminary form, a health check. Sort of how do I know if my police department, whether I'm inside or outside the police department, is doing what it's supposed to do as a healthy police department. And it's tricky because there are an array of factors, an array of metrics that we probably want to look at to understand if a police department is operating appropriately, is doing what it's supposed to be doing. In kind of the same way that, you check an individual's physical health. There are a number of different things that you would want to be evaluating to understand if that individual is healthy. I think the same applies for a police department. But I think fundamentally, if the community in all of its forms doesn't have confidence in the police department, doesn't believe they can trust the police department, that is foundational. If there isn't confidence and trust, there is distrust. That is a flashing light signal that there is a lot of work to be done. Beyond that, though, there are a lot of just a variety of different factors, but I would flag that policing is a tricky area to try to get to the bottom of how an organization is operating. And what I mean by that is police agencies are generally very bad at collecting rigorous information and data on what officers do in a lot of places, including a lot of big cities. Very important things like officers initiating stops of pedestrians or vehicles, for instance, are not routinely and rigorously logged whatsoever. So there isn't aggregate information that can be analyzed or pulled on stop encounters and what happens during those encounters. And even when that information is logged, it's often not in sort of a rigorous electronic fashion that can be easily analyzed. So there's a little bit of a catch-22. If police departments aren't rigorously documenting information about what officers are doing all day, and therefore what the department is doing as a whole, it can be very challenging for outsiders or political actors, elected representatives, to understand, to analyze what the department is doing. So then you get a lot of the department saying, well, asserting, that well, this is what we're doing, we're doing fine in this particular area, and there's no opportunity to independently verify that that's the case. And so I think, a lot of the work in this area is really related to trying to get police departments to capture information so that then it can be used by individuals to understand where there are issues, where there are problems, and how they may be meaningfully addressed.
Now, you mentioned that NYU and your work, you're trying to come up with an assessment tool. Is that going to be available to communities in the near, mid? When will that be available? Can it be used by localities in New York State ultimately?
The idea is to have this available far and wide to communities across the country to use as an assessment tool, as a report card, as a guide to analyzing, evaluating their police department. We want to take the time to try to get it right and make it broadly applicable, but it's well underway, and I hope that it's available to communities across New York in the near future.
That's terrific. You've served as a court-appointed federal monitor following consent decrees that were entered into by Cleveland, and you were part of a team overseeing a similar consent decree involving the Baltimore police. What observations can you share from those experiences that could inform and guide community leaders in New York State and advance this, get us to a better place, basically?
Yeah, I mean, the consent decree process is the result of a federal pattern and practice investigation, and a finding by the federal DOJ that local police departments have engaged in a pattern and practice of unlawful policing. And the consent decrees essentially are a whole interrelated kind of platform of reforms to address those issues, changing policies, procedures, practices, protocols, providing for training, new ways of doing business, really kind of comprehensively across an organization. And one of the primary lessons, I think, for I think the communities in New York can take away, the jurisdictions in New York can take away, is that police departments need to adopt what I generally have referred to as a culture of continuous self-improvement, which is challenging in a government space where there's no external competition, right? A private firm and, that's making widgets, may be, implicitly or expressly sort of embracing that type of culture of continuous self-improvement so it stays ahead of the curve and all of that. And police departments obviously aren't subject to that pressure, but the logic still applies that police departments need to rigorously evaluate what they're doing. And even in instances where they find that there wasn't any gross misconduct, or generally speaking, people followed protocols or policy, organizations need to have the curiosity and the commitment to figuring out what it can do better. Sports teams don't just watch the game tapes of the games that they've lost, they also watch the tapes when they've won, on the theory that you can always look at what you did, see and build upon what you did well, and understand opportunities for getting better. And police departments need to have that same ethos, rather than what I think is culturally the case in too many police departments, which is a circling of the wagons. It's a risk aversion, and risk aversion in a very specific sense. In terms of never wanting to admit any mistakes, because it may be used against them in a court or the court of public opinion. But I think that police departments can't be afraid of having more information, can't be afraid of more processes internally and externally that evaluate how officers do, how the department is doing. Because ultimately, a radically transparent department is one that has much more confidence of the public, and I think can withstand instances where individual actors maybe make mistakes much better. Along those lines, I currently live in Los Angeles. I relocated from New York about a year ago, and the Los Angeles Police Department is obviously a historically troubled police department. Rodney King in the early 1990s and the ensuing riots, and major scandals with respect to officer corruption, and they went through a federal consent decree process of the sort that places like Cleveland and Baltimore had. And it was a long process, and it wasn't always an easy process. It was painful at times, I think, for people within the department. But they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But especially when you look at where they are now versus where they started, I think that one thing that many people, not all, but many people have pointed to, is that when problematic instances arise, when there is an officer involved shooting, for example, because there is a greater understanding and awareness that there are processes, protocols in place to rigorously figure out what happened and to try to hold people accountable, there is a different reaction now than there was 20 years ago, say, amongst a certain and critical portion of the community. Simply a better sense that the department may take seriously what's going on, and may be more rigorously committed to trying to get to the bottom of what happened and how things could operate differently. And that's a different type of dynamic that I think, again, is engendered by a culture and the implementation of reforms across the board that are geared toward making the police department as committed to continuous self-improvement as possible. And so I think, in short, the consent decree process, there are a lot of different reforms and systems and processes, and setting up an early intervention system and providing training on stop, search, and arrest, and providing supervision training and different protocols for recruitment and hiring. And they're all very important, but ultimately they're all geared toward creating a police department that isn't afraid of critiquing its own performance and getting better as a result.
Now, I come out of a generation that grew up in Black Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights, where routine abuse by the police was just part of the norm. My father was a civil rights lawyer, and I first understood what he did when he brought me into a room with a grieving widow whose husband had been shot in the back of the head in a locked cell. And the grand jury refused to indict. So it's a generational thing, particularly that I've seen, stopped and frisked, all the things that have gone on. Now there seems to be a new ethos developing after the George Floyd murder, in terms of the protests that seem to be sweeping throughout the country. And I'm wondering if you see this as a different moment in America, whether there's an increased attention to this that goes beyond just the injured communities that have suffered this for so many generations.
I think it is a different moment. I mean, I've been doing work in police reform and accountability in some capacity for 15 years, and frankly, there are some people who I'm good friends with, and even family who. It was really only in the wake of George Floyd who started asking me really substantive questions about the work that I do. I think that a much larger part of the American community has become much more aware of not just the issues related to police violence, police misconduct, and issues of race, but to really substantive issues related to why it is that we still keep talking about police brutality, about police misconduct, why it's an issue that remains with us. I think that people's awareness of some of the structural impediments to police reform, like police union contracts and the like, are things that I think are just much more in the popular press and have sort of tumbled out into discussion. So I think that it's a different moment in terms of not just the rawness of the feelings and responses engendered across lot of different communities, but also just in terms of people's engagement and knowledge level on some of the specific dynamics and issues that are bound up in police reform. I think it's also a moment where different types of people are reaching the same type of different fundamental conclusion. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of different sort of talk about what's necessary right now with respect to policing. Some people say that policing as we know it should be abolished. There's the defund movement. There are folks who believe that not much needs to change. We need to support our police officers even more, given the current dynamics, and in some ways double down on how the world has looked. But what's interesting across all those camps, including that last camp, there is general agreement that as a society, we have asked police officers to do too much and to do things that they aren't well equipped or well trained or well resourced to do. When I go into police departments and talk to, for example, police union officials who tend to be very supportive and reflexively supportive of police officers and the status quo in many ways, they will agree that we ask their officers to do too much, to do things they shouldn't do, in terms of responding to a variety of social issues. Police officers are called really as in some ways the last stop when the rest of the social service fabric has broken down. Some people talk about the police being sort of the tip of the criminal justice spear, and that's right. There's nowhere else for the police to push problems, so they often have to engage with them. And so there are a lot of things that police officers do, and it's not obvious that they should be doing, like being the first responder to individuals who are experiencing a mental or behavioral health crisis, but not posing a threat to anyone else. Police officers respond to burglary alarms. In many jurisdictions, they take vehicle accident reports. They do welfare checks. They really do a whole bunch of different things that are squarely related to community well-being, but aren't necessarily related to even law enforcement or policing. And so I think that this particular moment across a lot of different um, kinds of conceptions about what the entire solution might be or look like, there's a common consensus, I think, that has emerged that part of the problem with policing is that policing does too much. And so, one thing that the Policing Project NYU has been developing a lot of research and resources about and helping jurisdictions think about implementing as a process of reimagining public safety. When we look at providing for public safety, are there things that don't require an armed police response as a first response? And if there are, what are the community resources, the governmental resources, the social service organizations that can step in and respond and help people address issues and problems in a way that can resolve those issues and problems, but not necessarily involve law enforcement? That seems like it is something that not only do a lot of different types of people from disparate ideological positions agree on, but it seems like a way that we can actually move the needle to reducing the volume of law enforcement interactions and then reducing the likelihood that there are going to be situations that become problematic. So I think that what we need to do is, in a thoughtful way, have some substantive conversations in each community about what public safety is in that community and what role police officers can play, and how that role may be different than we have assumed it to be in the past.
We're trying to, you're part of that, gather all the materials we can for localities. What resources, you obviously talked about what would be an amazing one that you guys are developing at NYU. Are there other resources that communities should be looking towards that you would recommend us to start publicizing?
Sure. I mean, there are some comprehensive reports that I think are great starting points. President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, a blue ribbon sort of panel that President Obama put together in 2015 in the wake of events in places like Ferguson, Missouri. They issued a very comprehensive report outlining a number of recommendations. It's 5 years old, but unfortunately, not a lot of those recommendations have been implemented by that many organizations and law enforcement organizations. So it is unfortunately and quite regrettably still very applicable here today. A more recent report, Leadership Conference's New Era of Public Safety report that I think was issued in 2019. Again, very comprehensive and provides very specific recommendations for what needs to change within police departments and what departments and communities can do today that can help make an impact tomorrow. I think people who are interested can always look at the actual text of federal consent decrees, which sounds boring but are really important because these are things that not just to the federal Justice Department and local jurisdictions believe were important things that the department needed to do to change to become better, But they're things that federal courts have signed off on, and in many instances have been actively implemented and have helped move the needle. So looking at what are in those consent decrees can be very helpful as well. There are also a lot of police officer organizations that are more forward thinking about where the profession needs to go. And I think it's helpful to look at organizations like the International Associations of Chiefs of Police Model Policies or the Police Executive Research Forum's various reports on issues and on various areas of police work. I'm not sure that I would agree with everything that is in every one of the publications of those types of organizations, but it's helpful to understand sort of what those groups believe are possible, and it is helpful to understand sort of what police professionals that understand that policing needs to be dynamic and responsive to the community, maybe kind of what some of their proposals are. So those are places that I always tend to cite to people as a good starting point. I would also uh, make sure that folks turn to a lot of resources that are new and that are emerging. Things like the Eight Can't Wait project, and they've got a lot of good materials, and a lot of activist organizations are putting together really thoughtful proposals for the future and the grounds for what is possible, or the ground of reform possibilities. I think is being innovated at the moment. And so, I would also, even though I don't have any specific, sort of a specific set of resources, of newer resources to cite right now, simply letting Google do some of the work, is something that can be very valuable to understand, sort of how people are innovating in the space.
Matthew, I really thank you for your contribution to this. I think it was very helpful. And we'll obviously get back to you again, but we hope, collectively we can have some impact on New York State at the very least. So thank you again for your participation with us.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.